Everyone, my name is Sean Steele. I am the executive pastor here at The Journey, and I am here this evening to introduce the re-uploading of our sermon from this morning onto the internet. So, as you may or may not know, Pastor Justin was not able to be in Sunday service this morning, and while pretty much everything went really smoothly, we had some technical difficulties which made the entire sermon a little hard to see and hear for people who were online. And so we wanted to re-upload the message so that people could hear it more clearly. So the message is just going to be an audio file, and you'll be able to listen to it. So without any further ado, here is the sermon from this morning, Christ the King. Our text for today is John chapter 18, verses 33 through 37. Pilate went back into the palace. He summoned Jesus and asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this on your own, or have others spoken to you about me?" Pilate responded, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your nation and its chief priest handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom doesn't originate from this world. If it did, my guards would fight so that I wouldn't have been arrested by the Jewish leaders. My kingdom isn't from here." "So you are a king," Pilate said. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. I was born and came into the world for this reason, to testify to the truth. Whoever accepts the truth listens to my voice." The text this week comes from the midst of Jesus' trial in the Gospel of John, where he is being interrogated by Pilate, who represents worldly powers and authorities. The reason our reading for this week is focused on the trial of Jesus by worldly powers and authorities is because this Sunday in the church calendar is called Christ the King Sunday, a week set aside before the season of Advent to serve as a reminder to us that Jesus is a king, and his kingdom looks radically different from the kingdoms and authorities of the world. In order to understand how this text speaks into our lives as we try to live out our convictions as followers of Christ that Jesus is king, and his kingdom looks radically different from the kingdoms of the world, we first have to collect a little bit of context. And from there, I want to talk about how Jesus' kingdom offers us a different approach than the kingdoms of the world to two specific topics: violence and truth. So, to start with the background of this text, we need to read around the edges a little bit, where we find Pilate engaged in political trickery, and the Jewish leadership playing right into Pilate's hands. Pilate, you see, was not neutral in Jesus' death, as some have made him out to be. Rather, he saw the Jewish leadership's hatred of Jesus as a way to make it seem as though the Jews desired the crucifixion of their own king, as Jesus claimed to be. In John 18, verse 29, Pilate asked the Jewish leadership, "What charge do you bring against this man?" In verse 33, which we read earlier, he asked Jesus if he is indeed the king of the Jews. And then later on, in verse 39, he asked the crowd of Jewish leaders, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" Pilate is performatively saying here, "Well, I don't know why you Jews are so mad at your own king, and I don't really want to crucify him, but you seem to be insisting." Quite interesting, isn't it? Let's keep on going. In the beginning of chapter 19, John chapter 19, Pilate has his soldiers mockingly dress Jesus in purple, the color of royalty, and put a crown of thorns on his head, then slap him while saying, "Greetings, King of the Jews." Once again, Pilate takes Jesus before the Jewish leadership and says in chapter 19, verse 4, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no grounds for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders, however, chanted, "Crucify," upon seeing Jesus. And this drama continues on until chapter 19, verse 15, which reads this: "The Jewish leaders cried out, 'Take him away, crucify him.' Pilate responded, 'What? Do you want me to crucify your king?' 'We have no king except the emperor,' the chief priest answered." So that's Pilate's game. get the rebellious Jewish people who desperately crave independence from Rome to beg their Roman provincial governor to carry out a state-sponsored execution of the King of the Jews, the Messiah, the one who the Jewish people had long supposed would liberate Judea from foreign occupation. Pilate's a damn good politician, isn't he? Just think about how the image that this gives off. Of course, Pilate is willing to play along with this and act all reluctant. He has a lot to gain here. He has independence-minded Judea pledging allegiance to the emperor and crucifying their would-be liberator. Now, let me ask you something. If the Jewish people wanted independence from Rome, and they absolutely did, the Jewish revolt that began only a few decades later in Palestine was proof of it, why in this moment did the Jewish leadership hand their king, Jesus, over to be crucified by soldiers of the Roman emperor? Some of the Jews, you see, wanted a military Messiah. One that would live by the sword, one that would dethrone Roman power in Palestine and restore the political state of Judea. That's the kind of king Israel wanted. And in what really is, I think, if we are fully immersed in the context, a major jaw-dropping moment. We see that in John 19:15, that at least for a brief time, the Roman emperor, Israel's oppressor, was a preferable Messiah in the eyes of the religious and political elites of Israel when compared to the suffering servant Jesus. And of course, as we all know, the kind of king they wanted was not the kind of king Jesus was and is. As Jesus says right in our text for this week, "My kingdom doesn't originate from this world." And that leads us right into our next section. If Jesus' kingdom doesn't originate from this world, then what kind of kingdom is it? What does it look like? On this Christ the King Sunday, what manner of king and kingdom should we be meditating on? And why should we care? Why does it matter anyway? In our core text this week, John 18 verses 33 through 37, I think there are two primary characteristics that Jesus uses to show how his kingdom is fundamentally different from the kingdoms of the world. The first characteristic is his kingdom's disposition toward violence, as we see in verse 36. "My kingdom doesn't originate from this world. If it did, my guards would fight so that I wouldn't have been arrested by the Jewish leaders. My kingdom isn't from here." The second characteristic is his kingdom's disposition toward truth, as we see in verse 37. "I was born and came into the world for this reason, to testify to the truth." I want to start by exploring violence. How is Jesus' kingdom fundamentally different than the kingdoms of the world when it comes to dispositions toward violence? The simple answer is, of course, directly in the verse. Kingdoms of this world engage in fighting and violence against others to achieve their goals, while the kingdom of Jesus does not. And I can just say that and move on. But let's see how these different dispositions toward violence play out. Some among the Jewish people were hoping for a violent military Messiah who would overthrow Roman rule in Palestine. They gathered their inspiration from certain passages in Scripture, such as the Messianic Psalms, which is a genre of psalms that you'll find in the book of Psalms. We see in Psalm 110, which some say is about the coming Messiah, say this in verse 6. "God brings the nations to justice, piling the dead bodies, crushing heads throughout the earth." Now, in addition to specific verses or stories in the Hebrew Scriptures that make God out to be someone who takes names and kicks ass, the covenants God would make with the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible were also often tied to the land. To be God's people was, at least in part, to be gifted the land of Palestine. The land was vital to the covenant, to being the people of God. So, with that context, we know why some among the Jewish people were expecting a more militant Messiah. But we also know that their zeal for political independence would ultimately lead to their downfall. As we discussed in our communion meditation just last week, the province of Judea rebelled against the mighty Roman Empire only a few decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus. and it ended with the complete destruction of the temple, symbolic of the end of an entire era of Jewish history. So we now know how engaging in violence, how living by the sword, worked out for Judea. How about the Romans, the other players in our passage this week? They too were a worldly kingdom that thrived on violence, and certainly much more so than the small nation of Judea ever did. Just like the tiny nation of Judea, however, the massive Roman Empire eventually met its doom, when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, was taken off the throne by invaders in 476 AD, about 400 years after the fall of Judea and the destruction of the Jewish temple. But what could have possibly caused the great Roman Empire to fall? Believe it or not, it's exactly as Jesus said. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Rome, you see, was an empire that was built in such a way that it could only survive so long as it continued to expand, continued to conquer new lands and deport more people to turn into slaves to do all the menial work that the citizens of Rome didn't want to do themselves. When new ways of slave labor became less frequent as the empire stopped expanding after the 2nd century AD, the country began to experience a labor crisis. In addition to this, the constant mobilization of Rome's massive army costed the empire so much money that they resorted to oppressive taxation, which caused massive income inequality to rise in fractured Roman society, with the rich doing everything they could to escape the taxation. And on top of all of this, despite the fact that the empire needed to expand to survive, it was also too large to govern. It was a walking, living, breathing contradiction. Even the impressive system of roads the Romans had constructed, an engineering marvel for their time, could not provide fast enough communication and transportation routes for Rome to hold together and defend all of its far-flung territories. Rome, you see, being an empire built on violence, was an empire built to fail. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Now let's compare the violence of the empires and kingdoms of the world to the non-violence of the kingdom of Jesus. Jesus laid down his life, and yet it was in that very laying down of his life that he overcame death in the grave. One of the central confessions of our faith is Jesus' words in Mark chapter 8, verse 35. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. Jesus, in his commitment to nonviolence, to loving his neighbor even as his neighbor nailed him to a cross, died. Yet he rose again. And the promise for all of us who practice this way of nonviolence here and now is that we may experience death, but we will also experience resurrection. Yes, it means that one day we will literally die and one day we will rise again in the new creation, but it is also a commentary on the little deaths and resurrections we experience each and every day. When we die to our need for vengeance, we experience the new life that forgiveness brings. When we die to our egotistical need to always be right, we experience the new life that comes with learning and understanding. When we die to all need to control others and to have power over others, all those things that might lead us to commit violence against one another, our selfishness, pride, and egoism dies, and our true selves, the image of God that was always in us, shines through. You see, Rome died, and it isn't resurrecting. Death is, in fact, entirely inevitable. But it's only when you follow the way of Christ the King that you also experience resurrection. Okay, so we looked at violence. Now on to truth. To see how the kingdoms of the world handle truth, we have to look no further than Pilate. From our overview of the background and context earlier, we saw that Pilate was not really interested in whether Jesus actually was the King of the Jews. He just wanted to make the Jewish leadership look like they wanted to crucify their own king and pledge allegiance to the Roman emperor. All he cared about was the appearances. And herein we have a model for how kingdoms of the world abuse truth. Truth is whatever is convenient, whatever helps the powerful stay in power, whatever upholds the status quo. We see both political and religious kingdoms use this tactic down through the ages. The Roman Empire called all people who weren't Romans barbarians. A truth that wasn't really true, but convenient for justifying their practices of conquering and enslaving people. In the Western world during colonial expansion, European nations would claim they were more civilized than the various people groups who lived in Africa, Asia, and the Americas where they were setting up their colonies. A truth that wasn't really true at all, but convenient for justifying their colonial ambitions. In the American South in the late 1700s and early 1800s, preachers and plantation owners would hold Bibles over the heads of slaves and say, "God says you must obey me." A truth that wasn't true in the slightest, but was awfully convenient for justifying the horrors of American slavery. And we could go on and on. The kingdom of Jesus, however, is all about truth just as it is. As Jesus says in our text for today, "I was born and came into the world for this reason, to testify to the truth." The truth Jesus brings is the opposite of convenient for those in positions of power and privilege in our society. When Jesus proclaims the beginning of his ministry in the book of Luke, he reads this from the scroll of Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That phrase, "year of the Lord's favor," by the way, is a reference to the year of Jubilee, a once every 50 years event coded into Israel's law, where all debts were canceled, all slaves were set free, and all ancestral lands were returned to their rightful families. God's economy is one where no one can get too far ahead of anyone else. This message of liberation Jesus sees as paradigmatic for his ministry is based on an even deeper truth, that all humans are made in God's image, designed to reflect his loving glory and likeness into this world. This fundamental truth, that all humans are of immense worth and value and have inherent dignity, flies in the face of all the false truths of convenience that the kingdoms of the world prop up so as to justify their continual dishonoring of the image of God in human beings. And I think by now you can see that these two dispositions, the disposition toward violence and the disposition toward truth, go hand in hand. Violence and abuse of truth go together, as do nonviolence and an embrace of the truth. So on this day, Christ the King Sunday, we are encouraged by the church calendar to reflect upon how the kingdom of Jesus is both non-violent and committed to the fundamental truth that all people are made in the image of God and thus have inherent worth and dignity. We are encouraged to think about how this kingdom of Jesus is radically and fundamentally different from the kingdoms of the world, which operate by using violence and abusing the truth for the sake of convenience for those with power and privilege. And my charge for you this week is this. Where in your own life do you see yourself living out dispositions of violence or convenience? Where do you see yourself aligning more with the kingdoms of the world than the kingdom of Jesus? And what is one concrete step you can take to make your life look more like the non-violent Christ who affirmed the truth that all people are valuable and loved? Amen and amen.